Let's take a closer look at that UV mapping method that I kept mentioning in the last video. It sounds like UV might stand for something cool like ultraviolet or uber velocity, but really it's just the letters U and V, and they represent a two-dimensional space with the axes U and V that's separate from our usual X, Y, and Z space that we work in the 3D view. So I guess in a way, when we're working with UVs, we're traveling to another dimension. So if it's a little bit tricky at first, then cut yourself some slack. Our portal to this other dimension is what's called the UV editor. I'll go ahead and split my shader editor here. And for this one, I'll choose the UV editor. It looks a lot like the image editor, but be careful not to choose that one because otherwise you won't see your UVs. So once you have the UV editor open here, then we can just select any object like this cube and hit tab to go into edit mode. Then all of a sudden you'll see the image that's part of the material as well as the 2D representation of our cube. So it looks nothing like our 3D object, but each of our 6 faces here are laid out across the image. The UV editor displays whatever's selected in the 3D viewport, so if I hit Alt-A and deselect everything, then nothing's going to show up. Or if I go to face select mode and select only one face, then that's the only one that's going to show up here. So we can click around on our faces here and see where each of them are on our image. Much like the 3D viewport, we can select things and move them around, rotate and scale in the UV editor. If you hit T and open up your toolbar, then you can see you have a lot of familiar tools here as well. You've got the Move tool, the Rotate tool, the Scale tool, and this other tool that does all of them all at once. You can click in the center to drag it around, click the corners to scale it up or down, or choose this little dot to rotate it. You can see it doesn't quite behave as expected, but I think it's still being improved. I'll go ahead and just go back to the box selection tool because I like using the hotkeys better. G for grab, S to scale, and R for rotate. Because there's no Z axis here, we can't constrain anything on the Z axis, but if we wanted to, say, scale along the Y axis, then we can do that. Even though it's technically the V axis, we still use the X and Y hotkeys here. So we can select our faces in the 3D view and move them around in the UV editor. If we select all of our faces though, you'll notice that some of them are attached to each other. So this one's not because we kind of moved it off to the side, and it's getting kind of tedious to try to box select all of these things. So I'm going to go to the face select mode here in the UV editor, and that way we can just select the faces. I'll move this off to the side, but if we try to move this one off to the side, then you'll notice that it's actually stuck to the other two. And that's because when vertices overlap in the UV editor, then they just become one. So if I were to take this one and line it right up, I might not be able to get it exact, so I'll go over to snapping. I'll go to vertex snapping here, and hold Control as I snap to that vertex there. And now if I try to move this face around, oh, it looks like the top one isn't snapped. I think that's because I scaled it. So I'll go to my edge select mode here, select that edge, hold Control, and snap that over. I can also use the 1, 2, 3 hotkeys here. But once I snap these together, then they are kind of conjoined as one. There's also a 4th selection mode in the UV editor that we don't have in the 3D view, and that is island selection. So all of these attached faces are what we call an island, and so if they're connected, then we can just select them like that and transform them all at once. If this was not connected, for example, if we just select that face and then move it off to the side here, then only this part would be the island. This cube is a pretty simple example, so let's move on to something that's a little bit more tricky. I'll go ahead and snap that back, tab out of edit mode, and let's select this sphere instead. I'll hit tab and enter edit mode, and select everything with the hotkey A. Now we can see we have this grid overlaid on our UV editor, and this represents all of the faces on our sphere. This is the automatic unwrap that comes when you create a sphere for the first time. You'll notice that right here in the middle, all of our grid is kind of squished along the Z axis here. So I could select all of these vertices and scale them along the Y axis up and down, and you can see that that will bring it back into a normal square shape. But even though the center here might be kind of square, you'll notice that up here near the top, things are a lot less square. Things get very, very stretched. So even though the lines are straight here in the UV editor, because the lines aren't straight in 3 dimensions, then they're getting kind of squished as we go towards the top there. So there's no real perfect solution here. You're either going to have things all cut up in the UV editor, or you'd have to have them stretched in the 3D view. There's just no perfect way to get a round object onto a flat surface. It's also why every rectangular map of the Earth is really distorted around the poles. Now, I'd also like to be able to view this a little bit more easily. So what I'm going to do is switch over to solid view and color the object by texture instead. So in case we don't want all of these lights and stuff distracting us, we can just go to the solid view and switch our color from single to texture. This is going to choose whatever texture is selected in the shader editor. So if you have multiple textures, I'll hit Shift D and let's choose our other gradient here. It's going to display whichever one is selected. So if you're working on a project and it's displaying a bunch of random textures that's not quite what you want, just remember that it's not what's actually being plugged into the material, it's just whatever one is selected. I'll go ahead and delete that one though, and let's look back at our grid. And if you want to display this even more clearly, we could switch over from our studio lighting to a flat lighting, and that way we can see exactly what the image looks like on our model. Now let's take a look at an even more complex example, which is Suzanne here. I'll hit Tab to go into edit mode and select everything with A. Now you'll see that she's sliced up into a couple different islands. If we go to our island selection here, we can select her eyes and move them around, her ears, or her face. Unwrapped faces look pretty spooky if you're not used to it, and it gets kind of weird, but you'll get used to it over time. One of the main goals of UV unwrapping is to minimize stretching, and we saw the stretching a little bit on the sphere, where it's being stretched towards the top, but on pretty much any normal object, there's going to be at least a little bit of stretching. There's not really anything you can do to get rid of it completely, just because no 3D object can be perfectly shown in 2 dimensions. But in this case, we have a pretty good unwrap. There's some distortion, but not a lot. You'll notice though that if we take some of these areas, let's go back to face select mode here, and let's say I scale up an area, or scale down an area, then you'll see that it becomes distorted on our model here. This is even more apparent if we just start moving around our vertices. It might be a little bit hard to see on Suzanne here, so let's go back to the cube for just a second. I'll hit Tab and A to select everything, and let's take our top face here. I'll hit 3 in the 3D view, select that top face, and then go to Vertex Select in the UV editor, and just move this one vertex around. And now you'll see that it's distorting on our model, and this is what we don't want. Now, of course, not everything's going to be a perfect plane, so some distortion is going to happen. But I want you to get used to seeing this, and when it's really, really extreme, we definitely want to avoid that whenever possible. You might find it interesting that what we're seeing in the 3D viewport isn't a perfect representation of the shape that we're seeing in the UV editor. It's kind of split right down the middle here. And that's because under the hood, all 3D geometry is made up of triangles, whether it's a quad or an n-gon or displayed as a triangle. No matter what you're manipulating it as in edit mode, under the hood, every single object is made up of just a bunch of triangles. So what it's doing is it's splitting right along the seam of that triangle. If you were to make that triangle explicit by going into vertex select mode, selecting both these vertices and hitting J to connect, something we talked about in the fundamentals of mesh modeling, then you'll see that there is no change at all. If I were to connect the opposite vertices though, then you'll see that that will jump and the stretch will be happening in the opposite direction. If I wanted to go back to a perfect cube here, I could just go to vertex snapping, make sure that that is the one that's enabled, turn that on here, and you'll also notice that it turns on snapping everywhere. So switching increment to vertex will only affect the UV editor here, but once I turn on snapping for the UV editor, it turns it on for the node editor and for the 3D view as well, which frankly is a little bit annoying, but it's just something to remember. But once I have snapping enabled, then I can just move this along the y-axis there, and along the x-axis, until that matches up with the vertex next to it. Okay, so now it's back to a perfect cube, and we have no stretching. Now there's one other way of selecting things in the UV editor that I wouldn't recommend you use just yet. So far we've had to select everything with A in the 3D viewport before doing anything in the UV editor. And if you deselect everything with Alt-A, then nothing's going to show up. And that can be kind of annoying sometimes, so that's why there's an option for sync selection in the top left. It's the two diagonal arrows going in opposite directions. And if that's turned on, then you'll always see your mesh all the time. And whatever you select in the 3D view, let's go to face selection mode, you'll see it jumped to face selection mode here as well. It's always going to match exactly. The reason I don't recommend working like this as a beginner is that, number one, if you move a face here, it's no longer going to be attached no matter what, but also it behaves a little bit weirdly when you start working with vertices and edges. So for example, if we take a look at vertex selection and we select this vertex here, you'll see that it's part of 3 faces. But those 3 faces are in different areas here in the UV editor. Actually, in this case, I picked a bad example. This case, they are actually all connected, and so it works as you would expect. If I were to select this vertex though, on this side, you'll see that it's connecting 3 different shells that are in different places. So if I try to move that vertex here in the UV editor, it moves all 3 of these at the same time, which can definitely be a little bit confusing and easy to mess something up accidentally by moving a vertex that's up here. You actually move something that's down at the bottom. It can get a little bit strange. So I'd recommend not doing that and just turning off sync selection just for the time being, and just get in the habit of selecting everything in the 3D view and just using the UV, vertex, edge, face, and island selection instead. Hey, pardon the jump, but one quick edit that I want to make is that I didn't really point out the fact that the UV editor selection works entirely in terms of vertices. So if we, of course, select some vertices, it'll do what we'd expect, same as in the 3D view. But if we were to go to face select mode in the UV editor without selection sync on, and if I select this face, then you'll notice that all of those vertices are selected as well. And that means that if I skip over this face and select the one up here, then it's going to select the one in the middle as well, because it's all based on vertices, and since all 4 of these vertices are selected, it is selecting the face. So personally, I find that a little bit annoying, so that might be one reason where you could work with selection sync turned on, but again, these are not going to be attached when you move them around. So that's just one thing to keep in mind when you're working with edges or faces, is that it will select everything in between your 2 selections. I know the UV editor is a little bit scary at first, or at least it was for me, and it takes some time to get used to. So after watching this video, then just try it out for yourself and split your view, add the UV editor, or if you don't want to do that, if you want to just have this be the shader editor, then you can just jump over to the UV editing workspace, and that'll jump you right into edit mode as well. And then that way you can set up your viewport to be just for UV editing if you'd like. You can set this back to texture for solid view, set it to flat shading, and then you'll be good to go. And that way you get this nice view over here on the left. So just get used to tabbing in and out of different objects and seeing their UVs over here in the left, and maybe add a couple different primitives that we haven't looked at yet and see what their UVs look like and try moving those around. Once you've done that, then head over to the next lesson and we'll learn how to make our own UVs from scratch.